morning, all. So look, I won't keep you any longer. We'll kick off. So thanks again, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our HR Barometer report this morning, Unrivaled Source of Analysis and Insights. I think we're all looking forward to this topic this morning. It's been great to meet a number of you over the last few weeks as we start to get back out and about and get back to in-person events. But I think we'll all agree the online world and the online delivery of certain content is extremely valuable still. And makes good use of all of our time. So welcome again. So look, just before we kick off, just some housekeeping. Everyone's very familiar, I'm sure, with all the rules around housekeeping and how best to run these events, but we might keep mics off this morning, guys. And we are going to record this just for our own files, and please use the chat box for any questions. So during the course of the presentation, do feel free to pop in the chat box and we'll deal with those questions, and Katie and Sarah will deal with those questions along the way. And again, look, there's different views you can select. So speaker view is probably the one we would suggest, but you choose what's best for you. And again, we're big fans of the video here in Cork Chamber, but completely optional. If you prefer to keep your video off, that's absolutely fine. So whatever suits yourself. So welcome to Sarah Fagan, Managing Director of Adare HRM, and Katie Ridge, Head of Employer Relations, who are our key HR experts here this morning to deliver this content. So with Adare HRM, people would be familiar with them through probably our membership communications over the last number of months. Adare HRM provide expert HR, employment law and health and safety advice. They support all aspects of human resources management. They give guidance around employment matters. They give expert advice. They represent companies at third-party situations such as the Workplace Relations Commission and Labour Court and so on. So experts in all fields around our people strategies, also around recruitment, retention, which I know is a massive issue and challenge, ongoing challenge for companies of all sizes at the moment. So look, delighted this morning to have Adare HRM here. Cork Chamber came together with Adare HRM last year through a strategic partnership. I suppose Cork Chamber felt that it was a really challenging time for our members across the HR sphere, across all those areas I just mentioned. So we have strategically joined with Adare HRM to help us and to help particularly our members at this time. So I suppose the Barometer is an excellent source for us all to use. It's right at the pulse of what's happening. So on that note, I will hand over to Sarah, the Managing Director of Adare HRM, to kick things off. So thanks again all for joining us.
Thanks so much, Annie, for that warm introduction. And look, it's great to be here, albeit virtually, to go through this year's HR Barometer report. I think it's very timely in terms of what's happening in the current market and the challenges and the priorities that are emerging from a business perspective. So this is our 6th series of the HR Barometer report, and essentially we're looking to gain key trends, metrics and insights to really help inform your strategic HR planning and decisions that are being made throughout the year. I'll be joined today by my colleague, Katie Ridge, Head of Employer Relations, as Annie mentioned, who's going to bring us through some of those key insights. And for today, in particular, we wanted to focus on the key HR metrics that have emerged, in particular in the Cork region, to really try and ascertain, where the focus is going over the next quarter or into the remaining of the year, as well as understanding the data behind it. And essentially what we're going to do today is to bring you through those key HR priorities, as well as some of the metric information. Health and well-being, obviously we've seen that being pushed to the fore of the last couple of years, and it is definitely a key HR priority for a lot of businesses and organizations within the Cork region. And to really understand the data that has come through our research and our report, because essentially we've seen that retention is a top priority, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So it's really about understanding what you can do as a HR practitioner to guide and inform your business decisions, to ensure that you do have a robust retention strategy in place. And all of that is obviously aligned to the working practices that have emerged, and a lot more businesses making decisions, in particular since January of 2022, as to how they need to operate and what are the guiding principles in relation to that. So Katie will bring us through some of that information to kind of show the trends that have emerged as well over the last couple of years. We started this HR Barometer just over 6 years ago, and we were doing it annually, but because of COVID, we made the decision as a business that we needed to ensure we're getting the pulse at that moment in time, because there's been such a pace of change. So we are doing it twice a year now, and essentially looking at that information over the last couple of years as well shows what is reflective in the environment when it comes to working practices and what is in place, in particular with the legislation anticipated on the right to request for remote working. What are organizations and businesses doing in the Cork region in relation to that? We also look at some key data from conflict and dispute. And I think, again, this is quite relevant where businesses have taken the decision that, you know, they're implementing more permanent fixtures in relation to blended and hybrid working. And what are we seeing? What are those trends emerging in relation to conflict and dispute as employees return to the workplace? And what are the key areas that could be addressed to help you mitigate those risks that obviously come from conflict and dispute in the workplace? And then finally, we want to look at pay and benefits. In particular, there's been so much talk in the media of late in relation to, you know, pay increases relating to inflation and what our business is doing. And as always, we see inflation as a point in time, but, you know, it is important to look at the context of what's behind that to really understand, okay, well, how is that impacting us as a business, our sector, and what do we need to do from a HR perspective then in moving forward and seeking to address it, and ensuring that, you know, we're taking account of the macro environment is very important. So that is why essentially I kind of want to look at those key points to really provide the context of you know, what is happening in the current market, in the environment. More recently, you know, we've seen, as I've mentioned, so much media and public PR in relation to inflation. You can't escape it. And what's really important to, I suppose, consider is the fact that employees are also hearing the same message. So for April, we're seeing that inflation has come in at 7%, and that's increased from March, where it was at 6.7%. And the reason that this is important is obviously because, you know, these are the kind of information that is guiding, you know, employer representative groups as well when they're looking for pay deals, when they're looking for pay increases. And certainly in the last week, we've seen ICTU come out saying that from a private sector point of view, that the salary expectations or salary increase expectations is around the 5 to 5.5%. And those are the information points that really need to guide and help inform your decision-making process, to put it in context of what you need to do, as well as understanding, I suppose, all the challenges that have come to pass over the last couple of years. Now, when it comes to inflation, I suppose, you know, it doesn't really come as much of a surprise that there was an increase, you know, as the economy reopened after COVID, if I can say after COVID at this point. And essentially, you know, it was always anticipated once the economy reopened that the inflation would increase, but obviously not to the level that it has. And, you know, with the other impacts in terms of rising fuel prices and the war in Ukraine, it certainly means that, you know, it's anticipated to stay at this high level, at least for the next couple of months. But the central bank and the ERSI are saying that in 2023, it's looking like inflation will, you know, fall down to probably around 2.8%. And they're anticipating it falling further to around the 2.1% in 2024. And why that's important is that we need to be looking at the 6, 12, 18, 24 month kind of landscape when considering what you're going to do for your own business in terms of in making those decisions from a HR perspective or a business perspective in relation to pay increases. Because you need to understand what is sustainable for you. We know that with all, you know, pay increases, in particular when it's coming from employer representative groups, that we're looking at pay deals that span the course of time over 2, 3, sometimes even 5%. And it's in that light that we're looking to sort of inform our decision-making process, which is why when we look at the Barometer report, it's really good to get that, the key metrics and the key data to help provide those insights and to help you forecast over the next couple of years. In particular, I think, everyone would agree at today's event that the employment landscape has had a great deal of pace of change over the last couple of years. And essentially, from an employment perspective, and in particular, the talent acquisition crisis that is happening at the moment, there's a lot of references to the Great Resignation. It's something that we absolutely have to consider. But, this has happened previously, like over 20 years ago. There was the same sort of challenges that presented, and employers at that time, did manage it, and essentially they moved through it in order to address what was happening within their own businesses. And the same will happen, for the Cork region, for businesses within the Cork region, as well as nationally. Will that happen straight away? No, because we have seen that there's a lot of challenges when it comes to recruitment. The pendulum has definitely swung in the favor, you could say, of the employees in particular over the last 6-month period. And because what we are seeing is that there's a great reevaluation, if I could put it in those terms, in relation to what employees are expecting, and I suppose their preferences when it comes to their role, to creating that work-life balance. And that kind of leads into, all the changes that have happened, in terms of the employment legislation landscape over, certainly the last couple of years, but also what we're anticipating coming down the line. And, there's been so many legislative changes over the last 24 months, that I was even just this morning going through them myself, and I was looking, okay, we had the Code of Practice on the right to disconnect, obviously the updated Code of Practice on anti-bullying, more recently the Code of Practice on sexual harassment and harassment, as well as the anticipated legislation on the right to request for remote working, the right to improve work-life balance, and all of those things. So the main point is that as HR practitioners, we need to keep a constant eye on what is happening with the employment legislative landscape, informing ourselves in relation to those changes so that we can prepare accordingly, in particular because, there's a lot of legislation that provides additional protections to employees, and that is set to continue even if you consider the Protected Disclosures Amendment Act, gender pay gap reporting, and obviously the information that issued, I believe, just at the beginning of this week in relation to that evaluation process. So understanding what's coming down the line will obviously assist you in preparing to make those changes, to inform your employees, and to start preparing policies in relation to saying, when we consider the macro environment in relation to employee expectations and probably ways of working in relation to what has happened over the last couple of years, and Katie was just even referencing it just a short while ago, that, the HR community probably wouldn't have anticipated flexible blended working happening, within this decade. And, it was something that obviously was propelled at speed and accelerated because of COVID. But what we've seen now is more bedding in relation to those working practices. And a lot of businesses, as I've said, are making decisions in relation to, what are, or how can we balance the needs of the organization with the expectations of employees. And this obviously has been presenting a number of challenges for a lot of businesses. And, certainly then it's impacting on retention of employees and talent acquisition. And it just points to the additional financial investment that is required in ensuring that we are looking at retention as a key priority, something that I will reference quite shortly when we go through the top priorities that have stemmed from this year's Barometer report, and in particular the information coming from the Cork region. Over the last couple of years, we've obviously had COVID-19 feature within the Barometer report as a primary challenge, etc. Now it has essentially moved down the list in order of priorities. But what, again, I think is a direct impact from COVID-19, even though, there's not as much talk in relation to it, it's definitely still in the community. And what we've seen is that it really has pushed health, safety and well-being to the fore. And, whilst we can all recognize that there was an absolute requirement from a compliance point of view always to consider the health and safety and welfare of employees, it definitely has moved up in terms of priorities. So looking at that information and understanding, where the focus needs to go will help drive those decisions. And I suppose that's the context in which we present the Barometer report this morning. Now, essentially, when we look at HR priorities, and every year for each barometer, we're looking to really benchmark what those priorities are, just to see from an interest point of view, we can see the changes. But primarily over the last couple of barometers, the more recent one in November 2021, a lot of the priorities are quite similar. And what we've seen for the Cork region, so businesses in Cork who participated in our survey, which was conducted by an external agency, Amoric Research, impacting 36,000 employees nationwide. And they gathered information from HR practitioners in relation to what are those top priorities. Within the Cork region, again, I imagine it comes as no surprise that retention is coming in as the top priority at 57%. And again, I think this is reflective of the current market and the talent acquisition challenges that have been happening, because we have seen, in particular with a lot of our clients, that there is more than natural attrition happening, and in relation to turnover, it's coming in quite high. And essentially it's because employees are putting their preferences to the fore when they're making those decisions. And in order to ensure that you're mitigating all the turnover sort of considerations, it's really important and significant that you are looking from a HR strategic point of view in addressing your retention and having a robust retention strategy in place that would help support the business strategy in moving forward, whether growth is your plan or whatever the case may be. Retention is number one, and it's similar to the top priority nationwide. Employee engagement then has come in second place, with 43% of organizations saying it's the top priority. And again, I feel that this is reflective of the environment. What we've seen since COVID is that there's a concerted effort need in relation to employee engagement, in particular because we are operating in a more blended or hybrid working space for a lot of organizations. And with that comes its own challenges, on the basis that, if we consider when COVID first occurred and the engagement sort of was pushed to the fore because everyone was working fully remotely, that had its own challenges, obviously. But when we've moved into the blended working space, it's also created additional and new challenges in seeking to apply something uniformly to all employees, even though there isn't uniformity in their working practices. So we're seeing a greater focus on cultural initiatives in order to support employee engagement. And I think that's something that will continue on at least over the course of this year and probably into 2023 and 2024. As part of that, we know with employee engagement, employee health and well-being is significant in terms of how you are maintaining the health and well-being of employees. And what's interesting from the Cork region is that both health and well-being and talent development came in third place. And all of these, if you consider the top three priorities, obviously they all impact on one another. And, ensuring that you have talent development and career frameworks in place that is working to your blended or hybrid working model is really crucial, because we're no longer, in the days of, full office for the majority of organizations, full office presence in relation to presenteeism, and ensuring that learning and development and career frameworks have additional investment will obviously have the added benefit on positively impacting any employee retention strategies that you may have, as well as employee engagement. we then seen performance management coming in fourth place, with 29% of organizations saying that it's a top priority for 2022. And again, I think this is reflective of the working practices that are becoming more permanent, ensuring that you have a performance management framework that supports that type of framework is really crucial. But it's also ensuring that from a culture and values point of view, that is filtering down into all of these initiatives, into your learning and development, into your performance management framework, because essentially the culture integration, in particular because of the blended and hybrid working, is really crucial to retaining your employees, to gaining their buy-in. And that's something, whilst has always been important, it certainly means that there's a business case for additional financial investment from a HR perspective in presenting that type of business case to management in order to ensure that retention remains a top priority and is being addressed by organizations. The fifth priority, again, joined fifth place, are talent acquisition and organizational change, coming in at 24%. And certainly with turnover being sort of returning to pre-COVID levels, I would say, for the main, it's really important that as we operate in a very challenging space, that again, there is investment, and that we're looking at innovative practices when it comes to talent acquisition, because it is an employees market at the moment. I'm sure I'm saying something that is of no surprise to most of you on today's webinar this morning, but it's also about ensuring again that your culture, your values are front and center, and looking at your careers page, looking at employee referral programs, and trying to be as innovative as possible will obviously help to support that priority as you move forward into the remainder of the year. Organizational change, as I mentioned, was a fifth priority. And again, I think this is reflective of the agility that was shown throughout the pandemic, which I think for a lot of organizations has just demonstrated the continued need to be agile. And with that comes a lot of organizational change and transformation in terms of addressing the changing needs of the business, the changing needs, or reacting to the market and the environment, but also in the sense that there is the skills shortage, and with retention and talent acquisition being top priorities, any changes in organizational change is also seeking to support the skills shortage and upskilling the current employees that you have, and maybe doing and operating functions in a different way. What we're seeing is that when we compare those to the national statistics or information that we got from our national barometer, is that there's a lot of similarities in relation to all of the top priorities, albeit just different percentages in terms of our participants who engage with us on the barometer survey. What was interesting to us when we were reflecting on previous barometer reports is that essentially, for the most part, talent acquisition was always number 1 or 2, and it has dropped down to number 5. But again, I think it's because of what's happening in the current market. Ensuring that you are investing in retaining your staff is really critical, and operating from a different kind of career framework that is upskilling those employees and investing within the current cohort of employees is something that a lot of businesses and organizations are seeking to do. And while they're still recruiting and resourcing within the business, the level of importance of retention has definitely shone through and reflective of the current external environment. So in relation to HR metrics, we always look at turnover, because I think this is a good indicator of what's happening within the market, but also sectorally and with industries as well, to really understand where you are at a point in time. And within the Cork region, obviously for 2021, we saw employee turnover come in at 14%. Now, that has increased in terms of the expected turnover for 2022, increased by 2.5% to 16.5%. When we look at turnover, we're essentially looking at the proportion of employees who voluntarily left their employment, expressed as a percentage of the total workforce. And with that, we obviously can determine what is happening or where the investment needs to go. So with expected turnover for 2022 in the Cork region coming in at 16.5%, it really aligns to retention being a number one priority and ensuring that within all of the top priorities, there is additional investment going into the employee experience. And I think one of the main learnings, we're discussing it as a business in relation to this Barometer report, is that we've now entered into a phase where total reward and the holistic and intrinsic value, both financial and non-financial investment in the employee experience, is really critical because of the high expected turnover rates. Now for Cork, the expected turnover rate is slightly lower than the national average, where it's expected to be 18.2%. So that's great that it's slightly below, but it is still high. And I think what we can see, and I have it here in the presentation in front of me, is that we really are returning to 2019, like the pre-pandemic employee turnover rates. And I suppose the difference being primarily is that now we're operating in a different work environment whereby employee expectations have changed. So how will that impact on any turnover within your own business is really important to consider. In particular, if we go back to the macro information that I discussed and the rising percentage of inflation and what that will or how that will impact on your turnover or your retention for the remainder of the year. Notwithstanding, of course, that the central bank and USI are expecting inflation to decrease in 2023 and beyond. Obviously, we need to see what the fallout will be from the war in Ukraine and how that will impact. But certainly, we saw a decrease in employee turnover for obvious reasons during the pandemic, especially in 2020, at the initial year of COVID-19. But that did rise quite quickly at the end of 2021. And, ultimately, it just points to what you need to prepare for in terms of that investment, again, in the employee experience. So one of the key things that we look at when we're considering like turnover, we really want to understand, well, what were those reasons for employees leaving an organization in 2021? And again, what I think is really reflective of the current environment is that even the top two reasons for leaving in 2021 were better work-life balance came in at 48%. So almost 5 in 10 organizations said that employees were leaving on the basis that they wanted a better work-life balance. Now, if we consider that, we're still in the space where not every organization or business has made that decision in relation to working practices, in anticipation of the legislation being enacted, and Katie will speak to that shortly. But essentially, what is very clear is that employees' priorities have changed. And this has been supported as well with the upcoming legislation in terms of the draft bill to improve work-life balance. But employees are taking decisions into their own hands and are seeking out employment situations where they can have that better work-life balance. So what this information does is help inform you that if that is the top reason for employees leading to the high turnover, what do we need to do as a business, as a HR practitioner in addressing that? And obviously, having the flexible working policy and practices in place will assist with that, ensuring that the right to disconnect and the code of practice and the policy that would be in place within your organizations is effectively communicated to employees is another item, but also ensuring that you're taking consideration of other reasons. So 43% of organizations said that they were leaving in 2021 because of a higher salary with new employer. And in relation to that, when we consider, all the media talk at the moment in relation to pay increases relating to inflation, you need to balance that with what is sustainable with your organization. We know that we're in a challenging market, and certainly I would say most employers are in the position where, essentially turnover or the reasons for people leaving does relate to salary in some way or another. But you need to also understand what is sustainable moving forward into the next 12, 18, and 24 months. We also saw as the next two reasons for leaving in 2021, some being dissatisfied in their role. And again, this could in part be on the basis that essentially employees, because of the high turnover and because of the skills shortage, may be taking on additional duties. And in particular, when COVID hit, I think everyone was just rowing in because it was all about sustainability. But essentially, where that organizational change is happening and employees don't feel heard, they are leaving employment. Another reason is that they're moving home or changing location. And again, I think the impact of inflation on the housing crisis is also impacting this. So knowing that that will continue over the next year, what decisions should be made in sort of creating a more flexible work environment in order to retain your employees. And certainly what we've seen every year in relation to our Barometer report is that, one reason for leaving has always been about career progression. So knowing that retention is the top priority, knowing that some employees are dissatisfied with their role, and that career progression is important to a number, and the majority, I would say, of employees. How are you investing in that? How are you addressing that in terms of your employee experience and their learning and development? Do you have succession plans in place? Are you workforce planning in order to address the greater challenge in relation to retention? And creating that balance with employees that will work for the business, obviously, is really critical, because essentially, the challenges will continue for the remainder of the year. So putting something in place that is tangible, that has key milestones, key performance indicators in relation to your retention strategy is critical at this moment in time. We wanted to understand in relation to, how organizations and businesses were addressing the high turnover rates. And we asked participants, what are the top 3 initiatives in the past 12 months that are addressing retention? And what we've seen is 33% of businesses said that it was increasing salaries and implementing flexible working arrangements, including full remote working. Again, I would say that the percentage of full remote working is quite minimal in the grand scheme of things, and Katie will bring you through that shortly. But the second top initiative in order to address retention issues was improved or enhancements workplace health and well-being initiatives. And I think that this has been a quite positive turn in relation to, as a direct impact from COVID, that there is that focus on health and well-being, and additional investment being created and rolled out in order to, again, ensure that employees' health, well-being and welfare is to the fore of the organization, but also because it's expected from employees. And, there are obviously legislative requirements in relation to the Health and Safety Act in that vein, but, it's more about putting innovative practices in place. So we've seen, employee assistance programs, etc., but we can go a step further in relation to what has been done from a health and well-being perspective. The top 3 initiative as well is a focus on company culture, coming in at 24%. Now, I think that this in the main is hugely significant, because employees, if we consider, what will engage an employee, it's really understanding the true DNA of the business, of your organization, and that filtering down from your business strategy to your HR strategy, and essentially into everything like performance management, and your health and well-being and so forth. And having that internal and external view in relation to your culture and your cultural initiatives is something that there's been a huge focus on over the last 12 months. And obviously that would be set to continue as you try to attract key talent into your business. You need to stand apart. So you need to ensure that you are promoting what that culture is, so that employees understand, what kind of business that they're commencing employment with, or at least candidates have that experience before they join. When we looked at the top 3 initiatives in the past 12 months nationally, then we also saw flexible working arrangements, including full remote working, being one of the top initiatives at 39%. So again, very similar to the Cork region, and increased salaries coming in at 31%, and enhanced or increased investment in learning and development. All of these areas are areas that will obviously address your retention issues and will hopefully mitigate any higher turnover coming in the next 12 months. But at least by analysing this information, we're understanding where the focus needs to be, and essentially what is helping or supporting retention as we continue in the challenging environment that we are all operating in. One of the other key metrics that we look at is in relation to the average cost of replacing an employee. Now you can see in terms of small, medium and large site businesses nationally, it varies from 4,000, 6,000 up to almost 15,000. And this is influenced by some sectors as well in relation to the IT and telecoms and so forth. But what was interesting to me is that, when we looked at the national average cost of replacing an employee, it was coming in just over 7,000. In comparison to the Cork region, where it's just over 9,000. So €9,145 was the average cost of replacing an employee. And when we're looking at, what does that entail? What is the average cost mean? It's everything from agency fees to induction to management, HR time, to lost productivity. And the essential sort of takeaway from this is that this is an increase, from a number of years ago, but it also relates to protracted recruitment processes on the basis that the current recruitment market is proving quite challenging for employers. And whilst that you have to operate in a very quick and speedy recruitment process, because of the shortage of employees, or the employee preferences in relation to salary expectations, working practices, etc. If you're not hitting the mark, they will automatically be moving on. So it is then protracting the recruitment process, causing the rise in the average cost of replacing an employee. And again, these are sort of key data that will help create your business case in relation to any additional investment that is required from the business when you're looking to invest in the employee experience, when you're pointing to the priority of investing in a retention strategy, additional health and well-being initiatives, revising and realigning your performance management, or even integrating further culture initiatives, doing a culture survey, etc. And all of this information will hopefully provide you with that data to create the business case and seek that additional investment. So that is me for the moment. I'm going to join you at the end, but I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Katie Ridge, Head of Employer Relations. Just a quick mention that obviously, please do any questions you may have, put them into the chat box, and I will look at them throughout the remainder of the presentation. But without further ado, Katie, you're very welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning to everybody. And I hope you're having a nice bright morning coming from Cork. We're in a very mixed bag of weather, I think across the country, but it happens to be sunny this morning, so that's something to smile about. Sarah has been giving you some of the overviews in relation to our most recent barometer. And it's my pleasure to spend some time with you now in relation to a deeper dive in relation to certainly what I would see as interrelated areas, that being health and well-being and absence management. And if we go to the absence management in the first instance, so again, I'm bearing in mind that most of the data, other than when I identify it as national, is referring to Cork and the experience as recorded in the participants from that region in relation to the various areas that we're reviewing here this morning. So for organisations who participated in our barometer from that region, the overall employee absence rate in 2021 was recorded at 10.85%. And when we look to 2022, the predictions are that the expected employee absence rate will be approximately 18%. I suppose in the middle, somewhat worryingly, is a 38% don't know. And I would use worrying in association with that, because information is power, and an employer needs to have a grip in terms of the levels of absenteeism, whether indeed they are dissipating or whether they are increasing. And indeed, in relation to the disruption that COVID has caused in terms of the workplace, in terms of how workers have managed through COVID, etc., and the fact that while we are out of the sort of heightened element of it, there are residual issues in relation to employees, and particularly issues that you may have encountered already in respect of employees returning to work, etc. So knowing where you're at as an organisation in respect of absence levels would be very important in terms of improving and consolidating around the bigger issues that we've highlighted, employee retention, welfare and well-being, employee engagement. So when we looked at the absence management, and the question was in relation to the absence management rate experienced in 2021, how did they break down in relation to short-term and long-term absences? And again, it wouldn't be hugely different from the national experience, that the trend would be that by far the bigger majority of absences are described as short-term, and that's coming in at 80% in 2021 and 20% in respect of long-term absences. And then doing a deeper dive in relation to the larger absenteeism cohort, so the short-term absences. The responses were interesting, probably not surprising in terms of the bigger cohorts. So 76% described the absenteeism as being COVID or COVID family related absenteeism. And I think we're all very well versed in the context of what produced that kind of high percentage of absenteeism. Many of you who are in the space of managing childcare issues would also, I think, put your hand up in terms of the stresses that COVID threw back on working parents, because the usual support structures like the creche or other child minding facility, indeed maybe with parents, and we all are aware of the quite draconian requirements around elderly people and them isolating from their nuclear family. So 52% of the short-term absenteeism were tied in with childcare issues. So both of the family-related COVID and childcare issues, I'd certainly be thinking of those in the space of work-life balance. Other issues that contributed were 43% of the short-term absenteeism was connected with mental health. so lack of mental health well-being, and then anxiety coming in at 29% in relation to people feeling particularly anxious after the COVID pandemic in returning to a workplace, in some instances not having been in it for 18 or 20 months over a continuous period. So we go to the next slide. So the next, I suppose, relevant question that we put to the participants was, does your organisation have a sick pay policy? And again, this is focused in the Cork region on the left-hand side of the slide. And 76% of the respondents indicated yes, they did have a sick pay policy, and 24% didn't. Now, that's interesting of itself because even as we speak, there is no obligation on employers to have a sick policy in terms of payment for sickness absence. So this is a contractual undertaking that 76% of the Cork-based respondents were indicating that it is a provision in the terms and conditions of employment with them. And we can see in terms of the spread of days that are covered in relation to sick pay policies. So it kind of goes up and down a fair bit, and obviously it goes down to 18 days in relation to 2021. And of course, this is the national picture. And the higher point would be 56 days nationally across the island of Ireland. But I suppose it's helpful at this juncture to reference that on the 30th of March this year, the Cabinet did sign off on the new sick pay legislation. And when enacted, and it's due to be enacted this year on a sliding incremental scale, employees will in the first instance have an entitlement to 3 days paid sick leave. And this will rise over the course of the period 2023 to 2026 to a total of 10 days sick pay. So again, this is something that organisations should be reflecting on and adapting their policies accordingly. So when we're looking then in respect of health and well-being initiatives, the question posed was thinking of health and well-being initiatives and benefits. Which of the following do you have in place in your organisation? So Cork employers responded that 57% of them had flexible working arrangements. So that's very positive in terms of there being a recognition, pre-legislative recognition of the benefits and the values associated with flexible working. And indeed, when we go back to some of the headline issues that my colleague Sarah referred to, work-life balance has come out in the top 3 in relation to the concerns or considerations that employees or prospective employees have in front of them when they're making decisions about who they will work with. So that augurs well as a starting point in terms of flexible working arrangements being something that is in place in over half of Cork employers. A slightly lower group at 33% indicated that they had an employee assistance programme, and then just marginally shorter again that there were general health workshops. And when we compare this then on the national scale, we can see that you're in touching distance within Cork of the national average of 62% of employers having flexible working arrangements. So, you know, again, bearing in mind we're a small island, we have reasonably good connectivity. Is somebody going to go outside of the county of Cork on the basis of there being, for example, better facilities available in half of the employers on the island of Ireland in respect of employee assistance programs? So perhaps that's something in your own workspace that might be a valuable review. And then in terms of general health workshops, there is a better scoring in Cork in relation to the provision thereof. So these are all issues that are tying in with the employer showing that they have a commitment to employee health and well-being. So it's understandable and it's easy for an employer to advocate that they have these concerns for their workforce. But I think, as Sarah made the point earlier on, people are voting with their feet. So if they're not seeing the actuality of these facilities on the ground, that could be the tipping point in terms of them electing to go to work for a competitor or indeed another employer altogether. So turning our attention now to working practices. And I suppose these are always dynamic in workplaces because we don't stand still in respect of the work that we carry out and the environments in which we carry out. And much of what employers do is nudged by employment compliance requirements. That's not to say that there aren't initiatives that are very much driven in-house in certain proactive employers. But when we look at the issue of remote working, the statistic is that in Cork, 13% of the workforce are working in a fully remote capacity. And in terms of remote working, we can see that less than 5% of the workforce are working remotely in relation to this figure. 5 to 10% of the workforce are showing up at 14%. 11 to 20% of the workforce at 10%, and 21 to 40% of the workforce having no remote policy in place. So the average then would be that you have 13% approximately of employers that are offering fully remote working. Now, that obviously has to be juxtaposed in relation to the context and the type of work that you have available. And it's very clear that much work could be amenable to remote working, and some work is not amenable at all in terms of remote working. So that clearly has to be factored in to each case on its own merits analysis of how you as your individual organizations are approaching flexible work practices. The barometer showed us that 43% of the workforce respondents have at least one day where there is remote working. So we would describe that as hybrid working. And essentially, that is a situation whereby there is a combination of employers facilitating some time away from the physical workspace for work to be carried out, and some time in another nominated space for work to be carried out. And again, you can see the breakdown in relation to the percentages around this one-day remote working facility. I think that in terms of the phenomenon of remote working, it is very much agreed amongst the professional HR fraternity that where the employer bodies or employee representative bodies, or indeed the government of their own volition, were they to have advocated the introduction of remote working or indeed flexible working in terms of employment rights around this, it is very much the view of practitioners that that project would have taken approximately 10 years to bed in Irish employment organisations, because people have been so used culturally to physically being and presenting in the workplace. And so while there aren't many benefits that one can point to in terms of the COVID pandemic, certainly it has acted as a driver, indeed a catalyst, for the state to review proactively the position that they want to take in relation to remote working. And that, of course, is going to manifest very quickly in relation to remote working legislation. So in terms of the barometer, we asked the question, does your organisation intend to introduce a formal remote working policy ahead of the introduction of the proposed new legislation later this year? So the respondents, 24% said yes, 48%, so nearly half, said no, and a big chunk again, 30 or 29% indeed, didn't know, they hadn't formed a view on it. So I think that in terms of adding value to your organisation, certainly from the perspective of remote working, thinking about the factors that would influence a decision to have a remote working policy or facility in your workplaces. The respondents said that the bigger consideration for them around introducing remote working was staff retention. So 60% of employers said, I'd be thinking about a remote working policy with the issue of staff retention at the top of my list. Issues around agreed outputs or targets and there being performance-based arrangements were also ad idem in terms of staff retention. The issue also of employee childcare and the need to support staff, I suppose, across the range of care requirements that people find themselves contending with in their adult working life. So if you like, at both ends of the scale, whether it's dependent children or indeed dependent older persons in one's family. The prospect of reducing the office or the workplace space, 40% of the respondents said that that informed their thinking around remote working. And attracting talented people outside of the immediate commute area was a big factor, insofar as 40% of respondents saw that as being significant. And 20% then were looking at reduced benefits and costs for the organisation. So, you know, the utilities that are saved on, travel allowance, parking, all of the office-based expenditure being able to be reduced significantly as a consequence. So it is important at this juncture to recognise that the government have introduced the scheme of the bill for their remote working initiative. And in essence, when that legislation is enacted, it will require that all employers will have a remote working policy. So this will have to be a physical document that all organisations can point to, because part of the proposed legislation includes a right of inspection in respect of the policy. And more particularly in the policy, the employer has to set out the range of reasons that might be proffered in terms of them refusing an application for remote working. And it's also important to clarify, because there's a lot of misrepresentation in relation to remote working and the proposed legislation. it's going to give employees the right to request remote working. It is not proposing to give employees rights to remote working. So that's important. And consequently, then the policy has to embody and be able to show the range of reasons why an employer is not permitting or agreeing to an application in respect of remote working. And essentially, the byline of that range of reasons is going to have to be the objective assessment of your business needs. So as long as you're able to stand over that on an objective analysis of the requirements of the business, it isn't possible to facilitate somebody with remote working. The legislation, the heads of bill, as they indicate, would show that there would be a 12-week period within which the employer would have to turn around the application for remote working, and that there would also be the facility for the applicant to appeal the employer's decision. The employer has to keep the documentation in relation to remote working and individual requests for 3 years. And as I say, this is something that can be inspected by the WRC. And also the legislation is contemplating that the employee can appeal to the WRC. And this would not be on the fact of refusal, but it would be on the grounds of refusal, that they weren't ones that could be lined up with the objective assessment of a business need. And indeed, the scheme of the bill is also proposing that the failure on behalf of an employer to have a remote working policy would provoke a fine of up to €2,500. So all of that kind of coalesces to tell us that remote working and a version thereof needs to be provided for in terms of organizational policies. And obviously those policies are going to reflect the sector and the requirements of the particular employer, but they do need to be in place because of the impending legislative obligation, but also in terms of the list of issues that are highlighted there by yourself and your peers in relation to why am I offering a hybrid employment environment. I'm doing so because I'm conscious that retention is the issue in 2022. I'm conscious that people struggled and will continue to struggle if they have to be permanently on site around dependent family member issues that will arise from time to time. I'm really conscious of the fact that I need to reconsider maybe the need for mobility. Like, is geography and mobility still relevant for particular roles that you need to contemplate the filling thereof? And I also need to be thinking about in terms of performance management of people who will be not always in front of me. So this historical facility of having oversight of people is not going to be available to me. I also need to be planning around how I'm going to maybe improve the quality of and the incidences of feedback in a circumstance where employees are comparatively more remote than they were, we'll say, pre-pandemic. And so I suppose it is inevitable, even in the most harmonious work spaces, that there will be conflicts that arise, in whether they are inter-employee conflicts or indeed conflicts and disputes that the employer finds themselves in the space of in relation to, well, indeed, the items on this slide here. So in the barometer, in answering the question, during 2021, did your organization experience any form of employee related issue or dispute? 29% of organisations in Cork articulated that they had experienced at least one formal employee-related issue or dispute in 2021. And top of the list was grievances at 24%. 19% of those issues related to discipline, so breaches of some codes of conduct, perhaps, or there being procedures that weren't adhered to, or there being abuses of various systems or processes internally. 17% of the respondents indicated that the disquiet, if I can call it that, manifested in a claim to the Workplace Relations Commission, or indeed on appeal to the Labour Court. And there was, 17% were talking about investigations that were misconduct or complaints of misuse of systems. And then 14% were lodging complaints with the Workplace Relations Commission. And worryingly, 10% of the disputes were relating to bullying. I suppose the bullying issue is always a very contentious one for employers. And it's important, if you haven't already had regard to it, to update yourself in relation to the updated code of practice in respect of bullying. Because, for example, there are clarifications in that code of practice in respect of what doesn't amount to bullying. So it would be important that you're operating off the current code of practice in dealing with something that is described to you by a complaining employee as a bullying matter. If we go to the next slide, the time dealing with disputes. So has the time spent by HR dealing with conflict and disputes increased, decreased, or stayed the same over the previous year? So 26% of respondents indicated that it had increased. 32% said it had fallen back, and 42% said it was static. On the national picture, 28% showed an increase, so that's somewhat comparable. A smaller percentage showed a decrease, so I suppose you're ahead in terms of that particular percentage. And then 52%, so again, you're ahead in terms of the incidences of dealing with disputes staying the same. And in terms of attendance at the WRC, the Workplace Relations Commission, or Labour Court, there was 14% of the cohort of respondents said that that is something that they had to deal with during 2021, and 86% said that wasn't an issue for them. So regardless of whether it's 28% or 26%, that is still a considerable amount of time that employer organisations are spending in picking over the matters of conflict and dispute. The causal factors in relation to disputes and conflict were indicated as 48% being poor communication, and indeed also coming in at 48% personal relationships between employees. Communication very clearly being something that is open to improvement. There's no cost factors there, there's no inflation factors there in terms of organizations looking at how they communicate and the effectiveness and appropriateness indeed of it. Personal relationships, there is certainly the view that there's always going to be some element of disagreement between people who are working together. but obviously that is very well managed with early interventions from supervision and line management perspectives, and indeed early interventions in the HR support end of the organisation. So it's not surprising then that I suppose, first point of reference in relation to difficulties emerging amongst our staff or team members is the line manager. So again, it's salutary to see that 43% of the perceived causal factors for conflict or dispute in the organizations that responded were lined up with ineffective or poor line management. 38% related to stress being a significant factor. Lack of effective performance management came in at 19%. The dignity at work, so covering bullying and or harassment or sexual harassment, that came in at 14%, as did perceived lack of transparency or fairness, which clearly is a cultural issue in organizations and should be one that is able to be mended by an organization, again, with little cost or impact. And then failure to meet individual or team targets and other constituted 5% of the driver for the dispute or indeed the conflict.
Katie, thanks for that very informative information. We do have a question now. It goes back to the working practices section. And one of our attendees has asked, with the rising costs in energy and facing into winter in the next few months, what obligation, if any, does the employer have to the employee in relation to the employee cost of working from home, powering their home? And do you have any information or thinkings here from employer side? Should employee be liable for their own costs if working from home?
Yeah, well, I suppose unhelpfully, there isn't any lead on this in terms of the government and how this should be managed by employers. What we do know is that if you like, the plant, tools and equipment that the employee is using are the obligation of the employer, as indeed would be the ergonomic environment in which the employee is working. It is important to say that as part of the proposed right to request remote working legislation, that the applicant has to, as part of their application, they have to provide considerable information in respect of where they propose to carry out the work remotely. And that has to be a place or a space that manages the concerns of employers around basic issues like internet connectivity, also in relation to integrity and confidentiality when it comes to dealing with sensitive and indeed commercially sensitive employment related data. But we don't have any indication as to how the government is thinking at this point. The fact that we've had interventions in relation to supports for electricity users nationwide might suggest that if things got a whole lot worse in terms of utilities costs, that there might be another intervention. But I think it would be a very complex issue to manage for the government in terms of setting down percentages or other prescriptive indicators around the utility costs that somebody would incur. There might also be, and this was in the early discussion around the general contributions around the prospect of remote working. This is going back maybe 20 months ago, when the relevant Oireachtas committee were looking at it. was also looking at the prospect of there being some revenue reliefs for individuals who work from home. So perhaps the current relief, which is very minimal, that may be an avenue on which the matter of escalating utility costs may be addressed.
Presumably though, Katie, if we consider like the heads of bill and you know, business justifications, which we anticipate changing on the basis of the pushback from both employer and employee groups in relation to the upcoming legislation, but where financial justifications can, you know, are apparent. And I suppose it kind of boils down to the request or the type of request from employee. Is the employee asking, can I work, you know, fully, partially remote, but from X location, and because of whatever nature of work, maybe they need a PC instead of a laptop for whatever reason, those additional financial burdens on the employer are something that can't necessarily be reasonable, you know, in all requests, and could have the potential of creating a business objective or objection to any request. Would you agree, or what would your thoughts be on that?
Well, I think the way the scheme of the bill is currently versed, Sarah, is that the refusal is really on the basis of the objective assessment of the business needs. And that's the expression that's used in the scheme of the bill. So that would certainly, the lens at the moment would tend to be around it being, you know, objectively evidence that it's problematic for the employer because of broadband. It's problematic because of data protection. It's problematic because of the way in which the work needs to be distributed or carried out amongst maybe a group of people, rather than it being to do with the plant, tools and equipment of the employer organization. So we don't have specifics on it yet, but certainly the lens at the moment would tend to be more in terms of, I cannot facilitate your request for remote working because the construct, as it were, of how we do business doesn't lend itself to you carrying out that business some of the time in X location.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we have to watch this space.
It is a watch this space,
yeah,
and I mean, who knew at the beginning of 2022 that we would have a situation in terms of householders needing to get support in relation to, and remember, it's just one utility, electricity. So if the unfortunate circumstance in Ukraine continues, and there isn't any indication of, unfortunately, it being resolved in the short term, then that is only exacerbating the provision of other utilities, and particularly oil is going to be the next issue for both domestic and indeed commercial entities. So there may need to be further interventions, but we just have to wait and see. So for the moment, I would say employers need to be drafting their remote work policy when they're putting in the grounds that they would contemplate as rational for refusal. They just need to be stress testing that against, would an outside disinterested party accept that this is an objective assessment of why we are not able to permit somebody to avail of their remote working application.
That's great. Thank you so much, Katie. And I think it's leads us nicely or otherwise into the next section, where we're just looking at pay and benefits. And obviously, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, like there has been a considerable amount of PR in relation to inflation, in relation to employee representatives groups, you know, talking about proposed pay deals and, you know, what they're looking to achieve for their members, for associated groups and so forth. So for us in Adare, like it's essential that we are asking these pertinent questions in relation to pay and benefits. And, essentially what we were looking to establish from a Cork regional perspective is what is the average salary increase likely in 2022? And as attendees can see on the slide in front of them there, the average salary increase in 2022 is anticipated to be 8%. This is significantly higher from the national average salary increase, whereby 5.3% was the average salary increase that is anticipated nationwide. And I think, again, it could be reflective of the challenges that Cork businesses are experiencing in relation to talent acquisition and, I suppose, retention challenges that have arisen. And whilst we have seen and Cork Chamber themselves are great at promoting all the additional international business that is opening up within the Cork region, and even Irish companies that have grown, and we saw some fantastic winners at the Cork Chamber annual dinner that are Cork based. It certainly leads us to contemplate what will be the requirements for the remainder of the years in terms of expectations when it comes to salary increase, with 52% of organizations intending to increase salaries this year. It's a considerable, high percentage, I would say, in particular because it's much higher than the national average. And again, we need to consider what are the reasons behind it. Is it retention? And most importantly, is it sustainable? Because essentially, when we look back and we reflect in November of 2021, our last HR barometer, the average salary increase at that point was planned for 22 was coming in at 3.7%. And essentially, we were starting to see employee turnover increasing as well at that time, but we are definitely at the pre-COVID stage in relation to the expectations. But this is being influenced by inflation. And obviously, I think I mentioned at the beginning, inflation is something that is a point in time, and we need to kind of understand what is happening from the labor economics point of view over the next 12, 18, and 24 months, because 8% salary increases may not be sustainable for businesses right now. And with as I mentioned, the central bank and ERSI considering the drop-off inflation, potentially from the fallout of the Ukraine war, to decrease to 2.8% in 2023 and to 2.1% in 2024, would it be sustainable now for businesses to apply an 8% salary increase, in particular because it's much higher than the national average? And even if we consider, oftentimes myself and Katie would quite often, and another of our colleagues, Tommy, be at the WRC and Labour Court, sometimes in relation to, pay deals and, when pay claims are being made at the Labour Court, we have, I would say, quite regularly seen, where the Labour Court is seeking to implement, a salary increase or a pay deal, that it's in the region of 3 to 3.5%. So what will be interesting is to see, from the Labour points perspective, will they start considering inflation when it comes to any pay claims being made? In particular, as I mentioned, because ICTU has just this week come out with saying that it's a 5 to 5.5% increase, but it has to be sustainable, and hopefully you don't end up in a third party or the Labour Court in terms of, I suppose, decisions that can be made in relation to pay claims. While they are obviously recommendations, there is the PR implications that we have to consider. But I think from a Cork perspective, it is really about understanding, okay, well, what are our priorities, what are our challenges, and what is sustainable? Is it 8% over 2 to 3 years? Is it something that will be readjusted as inflation decreases over 2023 and 2024? Do we consider what the forecasted average inflation could be, and then how that is significantly lower in determining, what you're going to do as a business, and balance that with the retention and with talent acquisition challenges that unfortunately remain in the market right now. To delve a little bit deeper, we always look to kind of understand what these salary increases would be contingent on. And I think, year on year, what has been quite evident from our perspective, since we commenced the Barometer report back in 2016, is that company affordability and company profitability remain the top two, contingencies as to why salary increases would be applied. And you can see here that, within the Cork region, company affordability is coming in at 64% as a reason as to, what the salary increase would be based on. So that's almost 7 in 10 organizations are looking at their affordability. And then it moves down to 36%, so 3 in 10 or almost 4 in 10 that will look at company profitability as a contingency as to why a salary increase would be applied. Essentially, what we've seen this year in particular is that unconditional increases is starting to creep in. This is something that usually would be quite minimal when we look at our Barometer reports and we're trying to benchmark, what those contingencies have been year in, year out. And essentially what we're seeing is that this year in the Cork region, salary increases will be unconditional in relation to those increases. And that is coming in at 18%. So just over 1 in 10, but almost approximately 2 in 10 organizations saying that they will be unconditional. And again, this is probably reflective of the current market, the skills shortage, the voluntary turnover increases, and the retention priorities that have stemmed and are quite clear from this report. Finally, then we looked at workplace changes being achieved, and those salary increases came in at 9%. Linked to external pay scales came in at 9%. So such as the HSE, primarily Section 39 organizations and public sector sectoral agreement orders, and other coming in at 9% in relation to salary increases. So essentially, those are the results from our Barometer report. And I think what, to me anyway, what has come across quite clearly is that we have now moved, into a new space. I think last year everyone was talking about the new normal as, decisions were being made in relation to working practices. But this new space is more about the employee experience and creating a better justification in relation to the holistic nature of total reward being applied from a financial and non-financial point of view. And the key benchmarks and the insights from this year's Barometer report, I would hope will provide you HR practitioners with justifications to create business cases in relation to investment in the employee life cycle, investment in the employee experience where it's warranted in order to address those challenges or those key priorities when we consider retention, employee health and well-being, and employee engagement being the top 3 priorities. How are you balancing that with the intrinsic value that comes from the non-financial as well as financial benefits, and rewarding employees appropriately, obviously, whilst that is balanced with the sustainability of your business itself? The change in working practices and what we're seeing as the more norm emerging in relation to what is working for your business and how that is being offered as a top initiative in relation to retaining employees, and considering that that is where the focus will be for the majority of organizations over the remainder of the year. What level of investment and what decisions need to be made to ensure that that flexibility is being achieved. As we've seen, 52% of organizations do intend to apply salary increases, and within the Cork region, it being significantly higher at 8%. Again, it's understanding, how that will be applied to your business model in order to retain employees, in order to attract the right talent, so that the skill set that you have within your business, whether it's upskilling your current cohort of employees, or whether it's attracting new skills that would be agile enough to move within your business model, and how that impacts on your total reward is very important. I think my final thing that I would say is purely down again to the employee experience and the investment that is now necessary in relation to operating in this new way of working, in particular to ensure that you have the right skill set, the right people within your business, that your cultural initiatives are emanating through everything that you do from a HR strategic point of view, and that essentially as a HR practitioner, you're taking your place at the top table where you should be in terms of creating those business justifications. So thank you for your time today. I'm just seeing that we have, let me see, one final question, and Katie, I might just direct this to you. So briefly, the question that has come in is, can an employee refuse to work from home policy on the grounds of cost or it not being suitable to the employee needs? So the attendee is asking, can the employee refuse the policy, the home working policy, on grounds of cost or it not being suitable to the employee needs?
Well, I think that again, as is proposed, the remote working legislation is elective in the sense that it is the right to request remote working. And so an employee would be making a request in terms of the facility to work remotely. So I would expect that on the basis of them making their application, that they would do so. And maybe the question is more about, could they retract their request for remote working? And I'm sure that they could, in terms of their whatever their objective objection is to now working remotely. But again, I think that in terms of the very escalated prospects of it being very perceived as very costly to an employee, I do think that there will be certainly, even if it's only in the shorter term for this high inflation period, I do think that there will be measures that will be introduced in order to manage the extremities that we're talking about might happen. So they have to happen, first of all. And then if they happen, I think that there would need to be some underpinning and or clarity in terms of, well, how does that impact on the new development to promote the opportunity for people to have work-life balance through one of the tools being remote working. But so we're going to have to wait and see how that actually works out. But I suppose ultimately, to end on a positive note, I think that it is a positive development that we are imminently going to be legislating for one of the tools in what creates a work-life balance. And the significance of the work-life balance, going back to our findings, is that being in harmony with your employer is the litmus test in terms of advocating positively about that employer and working there and staying and progressing in that employment. So it's something that ultimately, when used properly, can be used as one of the parts of the jigsaws in relation to maintaining or creating your own organization as an attractive place to work and to stay working in.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. I am conscious that we've run slightly over time, so apologies about that.
Thanks, everybody.
But thank you so much for joining us. For attendees who consent, we'll obviously be providing access to our full barometer report on our online tool, Linea. So we'll be in touch with you in the coming days in relation to that. Thank you to Lisa and Annie in Cork Chamber. Pleasure as always joining you and providing this webinar, and thank you for having us.
Thanks a million, Sarah and Kate. Look, it was really, really fascinating. I loved the comparisons, particularly between Cork and ROI, which was very interesting. There's loads I think we get into further. But look, we'll have you guys on again. It's so timely, certainly. And I'm sure, as I say, as you mentioned, Sarah, our members can reach out to you for further info. We can put people in touch, and certainly they can contact directly or via Cork Chamber. So look, we have run a tiny bit over there. So we'll let everybody go back to their busy days. And thanks all for joining us. And thanks again, Sarah and Katie. Really, really interesting.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all. Bye-bye now.
All the best.